Alrighty, people. Harry Truman. When people talk about great presidents of the United States, Truman gets himself into the top 10 a lot. But when he left the office in 1953, he was one of the lowest rated U.S. presidents of all time. That has to do with the fact that people thought that Truman wasn't doing a very good job of containing communism at the time. But when we look back on things, Truman was doing quite a bit. So let's talk about the troubled presidency of Harry Truman. Truman was from Missouri, the show me state. Great Truman line, the buck stops here. Okay, Truman was a good dude. Okay, so we start at Potsdam, which is the third of the war conferences. This one's held really after the European War has ended and before the Japanese portion of the war is going to end as well. Truman shows up at Potsdam eager to push Stalin on the issue of elections in Eastern Europe. That's the big issue of discussion in the early days at Potsdam. How come, Mr. Stalin, we have not seen the elections for the people of Poland? You can have your sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, but why is it that we haven't seen the elections? Why aren't we living up to the ideals that Roosevelt and Churchill laid out at the Atlantic Charter? Where's the freedom for the people of Eastern Europe? Have we liberated them from Nazism just to turn them over to Stalinism? That doesn't seem like a fair price. Now, one of the reasons that Truman can go the way he goes is because he has an atomic bomb test in his back pocket. And Stalin knows it and Truman knows it, but they're not going to talk about it. Okay, it's one of those little hidden secrets. But in July of 1945, having successfully tested an atomic bomb, Truman feels as though there's a little more bravado for the United States. The Soviets might have a huge population, but they have the cooler weapon. And that cooler weapon could bring Stalin a lot of hurt. Does he intend to use it on Stalin? No, but he doesn't mind brandishing it from time to time in order to show the Soviets that we have that kind of strength. Also on the agenda at Potsdam, the Soviets agreed that they will get involved with the war in Japan. It's not going to happen. And we're okay with that, because if we win, or if we settle the war in Japan, let's say, that gives us the right to resettle those territories and to set them up the way we want to. If Stalin wants to say that the blood of the Soviet Union bought Eastern Europe, then the blood of American soldiers should buy the right to resettle Japan. Okay, we also have to consider here that we've split Germany into 4 zones. That continues to be an issue of discussion. The creation of the United Nations is on there as well. And we start to see a little bit of that tension that's going to become the Cold War now between these two allies. Why did President Truman choose to drop the atomic bombs? Certainly this is the issue that hangs over Truman's head for the remainder of his presidency. The dropping of not just the first, but a lot of people say the second atomic bomb is the real blight on the Truman record. Now, in defense of Truman, military advisors had estimated that the land invasion of Japan would have cost at least 500,000 lives. America had only lost about 400,000. I say only, that's still a significant number, but comparatively speaking, 400,000 lives in the entire war thus far. So the land invasion of Japan was going to be enormously bloody. It was going to be horrible. And the war had gone on for a good 4 years for the United States. A lot of Americans were tired of it. They're tired of seeing their sons or their uncles, or their brothers go off to war. They're tired of the rationing. They're tired of the wartime problems that might have come from inflation or labor problems at home. They're just ready to be done. And so Truman's dropping of the atomic bomb, while it is, in essence, one of the great human questions of all time, certainly does make some practical sense for the United States. Now, more modern historians have questioned whether or not Truman was sort of shaking this at the Soviet Union. If he was saying to Stalin, hey, watch this, as a way of showing the Soviet Union that we were not going to back down on the issue of the Cold War. Moving along, containment doctrine. This is the real framework for the next 50 years. So if the next 30 seconds makes no sense to you, you're going to be in some trouble. Okay? The United States believed that the Soviet Union had as an intent the expansion of socialism throughout the world. And if you go all the way back to Marx, that's the way it's supposed to work. There's supposed to be an expansion. Socialism doesn't live in one country. It lives in all of them when the workers unite together. And therefore, what we were afraid of was that expansion of the Soviet Union. And so we tried to contain them. We did that with money. We did it with troops on occasion. We did it by bolstering countries that we thought were friendly to our ideals. And we also did it by taking down countries that we thought weren't friendly to our ideals. More on that in the Eisenhower years. But we are really engaged in trying to assure that capitalism and democracy are the leading standard bearers of the way the world should work. Moving down the list, as a demonstration of containment doctrine, the Truman Doctrine. Truman said that we would give money to anyone in Europe, and really anywhere, who are fighting internal aggression. Now, what he doesn't say there is, if you happen to have a problem with communists, you call us and we'll send you some money. Because that's what this really is. $400 million here, especially for Turkey and Greece, to fight the internal problems brought on by a socialist onslaught. All right, on to page 5. Remember, the study guide didn't have, or page 4, I beg your pardon, didn't have a page 4. So you got to get one. If you didn't get one, you need one. All right? The Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is the Truman Doctrine done bigger and broader. $13 billion in aid for Western European countries to rebuild themselves after World War II. Our thought is that a country that is in ruins is the sort of country that could go socialist. Big, prosperous, well-established nations, we think, don't go socialist because there's not enough upset people in order to make it happen. So we want to help those countries to get stronger in order to avoid that. Now, the $13 billion, you have to buy U.S. goods. So a lot of critics would say, hey, you're just trying to keep your wartime economy going. That's a little bit of self-interest. There is a certain element of self-interest here. Impossible to avoid that. The Berlin Airlift. Okay? On a grander scale, this is the moment where the friendship between the United States and the Soviet Union really splits apart. Okay? Stalin believed that the people of West Berlin, who really lived behind the East German lines, therefore in the Soviet sphere, should be a part of his territory as well. To push the United States and the French and the British on the issue, Stalin closed the access roads to West Berlin, which ran through East Germany. When he did that, what he's really saying to us is, are you going to fight for these people? Are you going to do something to assure that they don't starve? What we came up with was practically genius. If the dropping of the atomic bomb is the low point of the Truman presidency, then this is the high point. This is the moment where we sort of engineered a great solution. The Berlin Airlift, almost a year long of dropping all of the food and the supplies into West Berlin to keep those people alive and to keep the Soviet Union out of that territory, basically says there was nothing we could do about Eastern Europe. We couldn't have stopped the Red Army when we were trying to get through France and trying to get to Berlin in 1944 and 45. We couldn't have stopped that. But we're not going to let you have any more people. You can't take West Berlin and think that that's going to be the next step on the road to Soviet expansion. This is our containment of the Soviet Union there. Following that, we move on to other containment steps. The formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a defensive alliance that targets any invasion of countries that we're friendly with and says basically if you get into a war, we're here to help you. We also simultaneously then took our three spheres, the British, the French, the American spheres, and molded them into one Western Germany. Stalin followed suit by making it into East Germany, and the divide in the Germanys would remain until the 1990s. The point here being, though, that certain people in Germany might not have identified themselves as being West or East, but this is the Cold War splitting that country in two in order to push the interests of the side that we're on. Now, in case you're thinking that this is all craziness, that the United States is really afraid of something that doesn't actually exist, in 1949, we got real proof that it happens. Okay, when China fell to the communists. Here's China, a massive world power, a huge populated nation, falling to the communists. So that you don't think it's just hysteria, just a fear that is unfounded, the United States felt as though, oh my goodness, we're losing the world. We lost the Soviet Union. We lost Eastern Europe. We lost China. It seemed as though all the dominoes were falling into place. And when North Korean forces went into South Korea the next year, that seemed like the natural extension of the dominoes as well, as all of the countries of the world continued to fall to communism. So as I said, one of the things we really have to avoid is this idea that the hysteria and the hype that goes with the Great Fear and goes with the fear of the Soviet Union was completely unfounded. For the people who lived through it, it certainly wasn't unfounded. The fear of a nuclear war was absolutely true, especially after the Soviets get their own bomb in 1949. So going into 1950, if you'll skip down with me on the study guide, skip over the fair deal, we'll come back in a second. The United States gets into the Korean conflict to try and help out the South. After World War II, Korea had been split along the 38th parallel. The North was more associated with the Soviet Union. The South was associated with the United States. The North invaded the South in an attempt to push the Southern government to accept the Northern government as the real government of a unified Korea. The United Nations gets involved. That's right, not the United States, the United Nations. Why is that? Now, this is where we got to get deep. Truman knows that if he goes to Congress and says, we need to go to war, the Congress is unlikely to give him a yes. We have spent so much money on World War II, and then on the Berlin Airlift, and then on the Marshall Plan, that another war might seem to be completely beyond the scope of what the Congress wants to do. And therefore he doesn't go to Congress, he goes to the United Nations. And the United Nations issues what's called a police action, which is a fancy term for war, and we get involved there in order to stop the expansion of communism into those territories. Okay? When the U.S. shows up, we help, along with the other United Nations troops, and push the North Koreans all the way to the Chinese border, and now it's decision time. General Douglas MacArthur, the U.S. leader of troops on the ground, representing the United Nations again, would tell you that this is when we should go. Get the atomic bombs, blow the Chinese back to the Stone Age, take the Soviet Union, punch them in the mouth, and show the world that we're not willing to back down. This is the moment. And Harry Truman, president at the time, is going to say, no. A little restraint here is right. We come to liberate the people of South Korea. We have not come to encourage World War III and engage in a massive world war, an atomic war, since the Soviets now have bombs, against the Chinese and the Soviets and the Koreans. And so he backs down, and eventually Chinese forces invade North Korea as well and push the Americans back all the way to the southern part. So today Korea remains a divided peninsula, north and south, based on that 38th parallel. The last couple things for Truman are things at home, the fair deal. Truman believes we fought this war in order to create the perfect American world. We should make that true for every American. The New Deal, which was a broad range of programs, mostly temporary though, should be made permanent. It should be the job of the American government to provide for every American a job, an education, health care, a home, a quality right to an equal existence. That is to say, we should end the Jim Crow segregationist policies of the South. We should clean up America's act and make sure that every life is a quality life. Again, it's about budgets, though. The Congress is very, very unlikely to give Truman all 21 points of his fair deal because, frankly, they don't have that kind of money, and we're getting a little tired of the Democratic movement towards large government. Keep in mind, by the time that Truman is out of office in 1952, we've had Democratic presidents now for 5 terms in a row. Roosevelt / Truman, and Truman. And 20 years of one party eventually begins to swing the pendulum the other way, and we're going to get Dwight Eisenhower here in a minute. Okay. But if you're Truman, the last thing we should talk about at home is the little bit of the great fear, the hysteria about communists, the trial of Alger Hiss. Hiss was a State Department official who was accused of being a communist. Hiss was at Yalta with Roosevelt, so he was on the inside of the negotiations. This is one of those whodunit cases in American history that never quite has been plumbed out. Was he a communist? Was he not a communist? He's accused by another communist, Whittaker Chambers. Who knows? In the long run, he serves 5 years. Now, as far as really being online with being trouble, the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, certainly spies against the United States who sold the Soviet Union a lot of secrets that came out of the Manhattan Project, helped them make the atomic bomb. Those two were executed in 1953 for being spies. And we should talk here about the rise of Joe McCarthy as well. McCarthy gets his rise under Truman and really his fall mostly under Eisenhower. McCarthy is a senator from Wisconsin, and he makes his name by talking about communists. He claims that there are hundreds of communists working for the United States government, big policymakers, who are helping the communists to win, right? Put the pieces together in your head. Here we are kind of getting schooled in the Cold War. The Soviets get a bomb. We lose China. We lose a country like Czechoslovakia. We almost lose Korea. How do they have so much of an advantage against us? McCarthy's answer is easy. They're on the inside. They're getting the signals as to what's going on, and therefore we as a society are being completely hoodwinked by people who are decision makers. Now, eventually McCarthy is brought down by the fact that he doesn't have any real proof of this. Are there communists? There probably are. Are there as many as McCarthy says? Probably not. But McCarthy does nothing more than push an agenda that Americans seem to be willing to go along with. We are a very, very anti-communist crowd in the 1950s, and McCarthy touches a vein of American society that seems to be willing to go along with the hysteria and the witch hunting. Next up, Dwight Eisenhower.